So this is a big blow. It's like, of course, the intent behind all of this is to turn what has existed since 1990 as a military occupation into a settler colonial state.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. This is James Corbett at CorbettReport.com. Today is the 20th of August, 2019, and today we're joined on the line by a new guest to the Corbett Report, Dr. Mohamad Junaid, who is a teacher of anthropology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts in North Adams, Massachusetts. He's written extensively on Kashmir and contributed essays to several volumes about the Kashmir region. He has also grown up in Kashmir, so he has some experience, obviously, with the region and its politics. And we are going to be talking about something that I did cover recently in an editorial that I wrote for the International Forecaster. If you haven't seen that, I will include the link in the show notes so that you can read up about the developments in the Kashmir region, specifically Indian-occupied Kashmir. But let's get some more details and information. Dr. Junaid, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Let's start, actually, by talking about your own experience with Kashmir. And at this point, I'd like to direct people to a very interesting and insightful article that you wrote for The Funambulist earlier this year called Disobedient Bodies, Defiant Objects, Occupation, Necropolitics, and the Resistance in Kashmir. It's a very interesting dissection of what it means to really live in an militarily occupied region that I think a lot of people in the audience won't be able to comprehend from firsthand experience. Tell us about your own experience growing up in Kashmir and what that region looks like.
So I have lived most of my life in Kashmir. In fact, I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. Early 90s was the period in Kashmir, and it was a march for independence. In 1990, India began sending hundreds of thousands of its troops into Kashmir. They were not only armed with the national will of India to repress these pro-independence protests, but they were also given extensive immunity through a law called Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which meant that they could arrest, kill, confiscate property, and they would not be prosecuted within the course of law. So I grew up in Kashmir during that very intense period. This is a time when massacres of Kashmiri civilians were happening on a regular basis all around us. And so this period lasted until 1999, when I left Kashmir to go to India, to New Delhi, where I studied for my bachelor's and master's. And during this period, I tried to understand, and my research project during this time was for an MPhil thesis, to understand the Indian narratives on Kashmir. What do Indians think about Kashmir? What are the sources of this violent control that the Indian state was, enforcing in Kashmir? Eventually, this led me back to Kashmir, where I continued my research, and I started teaching in Kashmir for a year in 2008, 2009. But because of frequent curfews, frequent, security lockdowns, internet blackouts, communication blockades, it was very hard to live there. I mean, out of the 365 days that I spent there during that year, I believe more than half was spent confined at home. So then I came to the US to do my PhD, and I've been continuing to work over the last 10 years, writing extensively, not only about what is happening in Kashmir, but making connections with other such, events that are taking place, and making sense of what does it mean really for people who are minorities within these large, big, powerful nation states to exist on the margins.
Well, yes, making sense of this, I think, is really the key. So I'm glad we have you here today to discuss this, because the movements that we've seen in the last couple of weeks here have been very strange and very unprecedented, one might say. But first, let's get a handle on the region itself. First of all, of course, there is the Indian-occupied Kashmir. Across the line of control, there's also Pakistan, and you also have China abutting on that region. So you have three powers that all have some stake in the region, that are all nuclear powers that have all had their share of military conflicts in the past. I mean, this is obviously a volatile region, so a dramatic move like this can make a huge change. But let's talk about Indian-occupied Kashmir in particular. What is the ethnic breakdown, the religious breakdown, the linguistic breakdowns? What kinds of different ethnicities and backgrounds do people have in that region?
So to fully understand this question, one has to go back to 1947, just the moments before the partition of in British India into India and Pakistan. So Kashmir at that time was this region with multiple regions constituting the state of Kashmir. On one side was Gilgit-Baltistan, mountainous region that wanted nothing to do with India. On the other, and then further south to that was Kashmir Valley, which was mostly Muslim. There was 95% Muslim, Kashmiri Muslim population there. 3 to 4% of that of the population was Hindu. Both of these were indigenous communities in Kashmir. For hundreds and thousands, probably thousands of years, they had lived in that same region. They spoke a distinct language, Kashmiri, and had common cultural practices, except for religious differences, which were not manifest all the time in terms of any theology. They had very common, you couldn't distinguish a Kashmiri Pandit, Kashmiri Hindu from a Kashmiri Muslim, except that there were some class differences. Kashmiri Hindus were a privileged minority under the pre-1947 Hindu state that ruled Kashmir. And the Kashmiri Muslims were largely the disempowered majority. And then to the south was Jammu, which was a little more heterogeneous in terms of its ethnicities. There was a Muslim majority, broadly around 62% of the population, and a larger minority of Kashmiri Hindus. And I can tell you what happened there as well, because in the moment of that transition from being a state into its own to becoming bifurcated between India and Pakistan, and the coming of Jammu and Kashmir under the control of India, it was occasioned also by a massive massacre and ethnic cleansing in this region of Jammu, where close to 200,000 Muslims and even more were either massacred or pushed out into the Pakistani control side and beyond. And so that region became a Hindu majority region during this time. And then there was this larger area of Ladakh, which was a sparsely populated, high altitude, cold desert, where there were like close to 46% Buddhists and 46% Muslims, and the rest were smaller other communities. And the part of that region, Aksai Chin, which is under Chinese control now, came under Chinese control only in 1962. But China claims the larger region of Ladakh as part of of China. So this region became bifurcated in between 1947 and 49, during the war between India and Pakistan. And in a way, it was like extension of this partition principle that was imposed on Kashmir without Kashmiris having any say about what their future should be like.
Right. Well, that does bring up the question, because you note that there was the privileged Hindu minority in the Hindu state of Kashmir at that time. And I think the presumption would be that the Hindu leaders essentially sold the population out to India by signing the agreement to put themselves under India to whatever extent in the semi-autonomous state of Jammu and Kashmir. Is there truth to that, or was that something that was broadly supported by the Kashmiri population at that time?
So before and immediately after 1947, there were several political tendencies within Kashmir. There was, among the Kashmiri Muslim majority, there was a class-based uprising against the Dogra regime. They wanted Kashmiris to have the same rights as Kashmiri Hindus were enjoying. But it would be unfair to say that all Kashmiri Pandits kind of sold Kashmiri Muslims over to India. Within Kashmiri Pandits are not a unified voice. Among them, there were socialists, there were people who were also worried about what the Hindu state had done to the Kashmiri Muslims, and they didn't want to sell off Kashmiri Muslims to anyone. But yes, there were strong voices within that minority privileged elite who wanted those privileges to be retained after 1947. So after 1947, a very important development took place. There were something called land reforms, where the Kashmiri leaders at that time, who had promised that once we get rid of this oppressive Hindu state, we'll be free to conduct, economic reforms so that this injustice that had been carried out for more than 46 could be corrected, and land could be distributed from big feudal landlords to the Kashmir's impoverished peasantry. And that when that was carried out, a lot of Kashmiri pundits who did hold large pieces, tracts of land in Kashmir, and there were like Kashmir, some Muslims as well who held those tracts of land. They began to have a reactionary response to this land reforms. And in 1953, there was a coup against the Sheikh Abdullah government, who was the leader at that time who had carried out the land reforms, and he was put in prison in connivance with the Indian state for more than 11, 12 years. And so that's the beginning of the loss of the promises that were made to Kashmiris in that era. So I just want to say that it's a very complicated picture. I don't want to say that Kashmiri Hindus speak with one voice. There were voices who saw themselves more closer to Kashmir's Muslim majority than with the Indian Hindus.
All right, well, that gets us into the meat and potatoes of Article 370 and Article 35A and all of these terms that we've heard in the news recently that I think most people probably have no idea what this is actually about. And I know this is a huge, huge topic, but how do we condense it down for people who are just learning about this? How can you describe the autonomy of the Jammu and Kashmir region under India that existed and that has apparently just been revoked by parliamentary measure? What exactly took place here in the last couple of weeks?
So again, like the two key provisions that were part of Indian Constitution were Article 370 and Article 35A. Now, the history of these provisions goes back again to 1947, when the last Hindu ruler of Kashmir in 1947 decided to join Hindu majority India against the wishes of his Muslim majority subjects. The Indian state was quite nervous that this arrangement was not going to last because the Hindu king's decision had no popular support in Kashmir. And there were some Kashmiri Muslim leaders, including Sheikh Abdullah, who was at that time convinced by the Indian leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru that if you have some kind of, if you endorse the Hindu ruler's decision, we will give Kashmir autonomy, because even the Hindu ruler's decision, which was called the Instrument of Accession, gave India powers over only three matters: defense, communications, and external affairs. The rest of the stuff that states do were to be under the Kashmir state's own control. Now, the negotiations between the Muslim leaders of Kashmir, some of the Muslim leaders of Kashmir, and the Indian leaders led to the enshrinement of an article in the Indian Constitution called Article 370, which broadly defined Kashmir's relationship with India, where Kashmir had to have what they called a special status. It simply meant autonomy. This provision was gradually, as I mentioned earlier, in 1953, when the coup took place, the provisions, the content of the Article 370 was gradually eroded. For instance, Kashmir was supposed to have a prime minister, its own president, its own state flag. It was supposed to make laws that would apply to Kashmir. Indian parliament couldn't make laws that could apply to Kashmir. But these things didn't matter. Kashmir was supposed to have its own superior court. But these things were gradually taken away until, on August 5, 2019, when the article was completely scrapped. The other article, Article 35A, actually had its history even before 1947. And it was Kashmiri Hindus, the small minority who had been privileged, who were worried that the Punjabi Hindus were going to come to Kashmir and take away their jobs. So they pleaded with their Hindu ruler to, make Kashmir for Kashmiris. They were not under any threat from Kashmiri Muslims at that time, who were not given education or any benefits anyway. So the Hindu state in Kashmir had created this special provisions to protect the Kashmiri Hindus. And after 1947, this Kashmir for Kashmiris, where Kashmiris could have a permanent residency, they could buy and purchase immovable property in the area, apply for government jobs, was limited to Kashmiris. And this is a key blow to Kashmiris right now, because what it has done is opened up avenues for Indians to come in, Indian capital to come in, rich Indians who can buy land in Kashmir, and also push in Hindus into a territory which is demographically as well as ecologically very sensitive.
That's right. So Article 370 and Article 35A have been rejiggered so that the autonomy or semi-autonomy that Jammu and Kashmir formerly enjoyed has been revoked, essentially. And my understanding is that the region is now going to be split into two federally administered territories?
Yes. So what the Indian government has done is split apart this territory that has existed as one since 1846. And completely taken away, not only made Kashmir equal, which is what it was telling its constituents, but actually demoted and downgraded the status of this territory. Now, Ladakh, which is sparsely populated, will have no legislative assembly and will be directly ruled from New Delhi. And Jammu and Kashmir was supposed to have some kind of legislative power, but very minimal. But the key elements like control over land use, as well as the police, will be under the Indian government. So this is a big blow. It's like, of course, the intent behind all of this is to turn what has existed since 1990 as a military occupation into a settler colonial state.
Yes, I mean, I'm wondering if there is any other possible justification for this. Of course, Modi has been saying, Prime Minister Modi has been saying in recent days that this is in response to terrorism in the region and what have you. But is there any sensible reason that could possibly be forwarded for this move other than simply the creation of the sort of the BJP Hindu nationalist state or the next extension in that vision?
Well, it's very hard to understand how it is going to, prevent people from taking up arms against the state. In fact, it's going to drive more people in Kashmir, because not only has the state alienated and pushed aside the voices of Kashmiris who want freedom from India, they have now even completely undermined its own loyalists in Kashmir. All the pro-India politicians in Kashmir are under arrest right now. They have disarmed the Kashmiri police, the same Kashmiri police who have acted as second fiddle, as well as like the arm of the forcible arm of the Indian state in Kashmir for so long. So it's only going to increase violence, if anything. The second point about that Modi has been making about development is cock and bull story. In Kashmir, there are already Indian companies who do business. There is big Indian companies like Reliance, Bharti Telecom, and like HDFC, and many other companies who invest and do business in Kashmir. Indian companies have been given 99-year leases by the Indian Kashmir state government over land, which is practically for 99-year lease means for 100 years they can be there and then renew the leases. And so I think that nothing in Kashmir has prevented investments from taking place, except the fact that the state is so repressive. The state has destroyed the infrastructure of the state. The Indian state has, like, through militarization of public spaces, through curfews and blocking people from continuing their everyday life and business activities, it has, basically tamped down on the Kashmiri economy and livelihood. I mean, many Indian economists themselves have been saying that despite all the state violence in Kashmir and the clampdowns, Kashmir's human development indicators are way better than many of the other states that are directly ruled by the Mr. Modi's own party.
So I guess the real question is, why now? What changed in the political calculation that enabled Modi and the Indian government to do this at this point?
Well, two things. One has to do with what has happened in India over the last few decades. And second, what is happening globally at the present juncture. Let me take you first to what has been happening within India and who is Modi. So Modi is a lifelong member of this organization called RSS. RSS means Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. It is a world's largest right-wing paramilitary organization that has existed since 1920s. It is a Hindu supremacist organization which believes that non-Hindus within India if they want to live in India, must live subservient to Hindu interests, must live as second-class citizens. And so they have been targeting Kashmir's Muslim majority for a very long time. If you go to their website, they still say the biggest problem, key issue in Kashmir is the Muslim majority, which needs to be turned into a disempowered minority. They do not like Muslims anywhere in India having any kind of political say. So, I mean, this has happened over the last 8 years since Modi came to power, especially. Extensive violence that has been carried out on Muslims in the name of cows and stuff. And so this is a long-term RSS agenda. And right now, they have a majority in the Indian parliament, which they feel is like that the Indian national will is behind them, and they can do whatever they want in Kashmir, and nobody is going to stop them. Unfortunately, it is true because in India, the Indian media has simply kowtowed to the Indian nationalism. Like anyone who questions Indian Modi or Indian government's policies is instantly labeled as anti-India or anti-national and castigated. So this is one. The second is the international moment we're living in. Over the last few years, we know with the rise of populist right-wing governments, in the West, the liberals, world order, which was based on some degree of respect for human rights, which was built on some degree of respect for the rights of minorities, has eroded. And right now, Modi's actions are getting support from some of the most racist, anti-immigrant, populist leaders around the world. And so Modi feels that somehow he is at the right moment, at the crust of a certain time where he can do this and get away with it. So he feels that because nobody seems to care about human rights of people anymore, he has a carte blanche, a license to do whatever he wants in Kashmir.
If that is the calculus, it seems like a miscalculation to me, because obviously Pakistan has been quite vociferously opposed to this, as we could all have predicted. China, through their foreign office, has issued statements to the effect that they are unhappy with this and that India should exercise caution. The United Nations Security Council and where the United Nations Secretary General has issued statements to that effect. Even the United States, which has been quite close with India in building an Indo-Pacific world order to presumably roadblock China and the creation of a Chinese Asian order, has issued some caution on this matter and saying that asking for restraint. So it doesn't seem like Modi has a lot of political support. Even within India, the Indian political opposition seems opposed to this move, which is, again, quite a bold change in the status quo. I feel it's a miscalculation. I feel that this will not go easily. What's your sense on the direction that this is heading geopolitically?
I think what Modi and his, close confidants were not calculating was the international response, the international media's response. Um, the initial response has been due to the outcry among the Kashmiri diaspora. They have, rejuvenated interest in Kashmir around the world. They've tried to make the media aware to take interest in what is happening there. But Modi has also, I just came back from India. I spent like some time in Delhi, and I was speaking to writers, activists, filmmakers. They feel really stifled. They feel that India has lost its trajectory, that it has lost some of its liberal traditions, irrevocably, and they are feeling like, I mean, of course, Kashmiris have been pushed to the wall and repressed on the jackboot, but Indian liberals are also feeling the same way. So I think that and many minorities, smaller states in India feel that if India could unilaterally do this to Kashmiris, they can do the same thing to them. So there has been, I agree with you, there has been some degree of response. In many cases, the response from Congress, which is the main opposition party, which has a smaller number of members in the Indian parliament, has been very strange. Like on one side, the party has opposed the move. On the other side, there are independent voices that have either supported Modi government or have been very tepid in their response. There are like parties like BSP and the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, which have like come out surprisingly in support of Modi government. Of course, it doesn't surprise Kashmiris so much, but it has. And India, of course, did not really calculate the response of the international community, China or Pakistan so much. I still think that the what United Nations, it means that somehow the UN Security Council taking up the question of Kashmir, although in a very flimsy manner, does bring attention back after 50 years to Kashmir internationally. But the lack of a joint statement at the end of it is like a glaring mistake. I think that it puts the credibility of the international community at grave risk. Because what is unfolding right now in Kashmir is not simply a permanent change in its status, but a humanitarian disaster.
That's right. And the thing that angers me most about these types of issues is that it generally does go into the talk about what does this major world power think about it, or what does that major world power think about it. But what about the Kashmiris themselves? And unfortunately, that's the big excluded part of this conversation, because the region has been on such an incredible lockdown over the past couple of weeks. Can you tell us about what is happening in the region right now and how the Kashmiris are responding to it so far?
Well, so before August 5, when the Indian Parliament took this unilateral decision, for close to 2 weeks, Indian government had been circulating these official orders. They were bringing in, additional paramilitary forces and army into Kashmir. There are already close to 800,000, 750,000 soldiers in Kashmir. And by now, they have brought the number to 1 million. So they were like blocking, neighborhoods, separating neighborhoods, separating families from each other, arresting activists, journalists, academics, political leaders. They were also they blocked the internet completely, cut off phones of people, landlines. So the world was totally isolated. Kashmir was, before this order was passed in the parliament, Kashmir had become the world's largest open-air prison, where Kashmiris outside could not speak to their families inside at all. And so even now, we don't know what is happening across Kashmir. We have some visuals, some reports coming from uptown areas of main city of Srinagar, but we don't know what is happening in South Kashmir, which has been the epicenter of protest against India for years now. And so most Kashmiris haven't been even told that a decision about their fate has already been made by India. So I don't know what is going to happen once people come to know, and if India and when it eases the pressure on Kashmir. Kashmir looks like a pressure cooker right now.
That's right. And as the most militarized, or at least one of the most militarized regions in the world, on the crossroads of three major nuclear powers, this is not a situation to take lightly. That's why I hope people are following it. And so I will direct people to the article that I wrote that I mentioned at the top of this conversation, as well as your article about disobedient bodies, defiant objects, which I will link in the show notes for this conversation. I'll also be directing people to your Twitter account at mjunaidr. And obviously the link will be there in the show notes if people are interested in that. Finally, are there any other sources or news outlets in English that you would direct people to that might be good sources for information in the region?
I would direct people to the resources that people at standwithkashmir.com have put together. There are Kashmiri academics and non-Kashmiri academics who have deep interest and scholarship on Kashmir. There's critical Kashmir scholars and Kashmir Scholars Consultative Network that people can follow. They put together reports on Kashmir. There have been some Indian news agencies who've done good reportage on Kashmir. The Wire.in has been active, but unfortunately, I couldn't say that about most of the Indian news media right now.
All right. Well, I will definitely be keeping my eye on this situation, and I'll be looking forward to further reports from yourself and others. So thank you very much for the update today, Dr. Mohamad Junaid. I very much appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.